Europe's manufacturing heartland is experiencing something unprecedented in the post-war era. German industrial electricity costs have risen 400% since 2021, while Chinese manufacturers pay one-fifth the price. This isn't a temporary disruption. This is the systematic dismantling of a continental industrial base that took 70 years to build. The scale dwarfs from previous industrial relocations. When Britain lost textile manufacturing to Asia, it represented 3% of GDP. Europe's energy-intensive industries represent 15% of continental economic output. European manufacturing dominated global markets for decades through a simple formula. Abundant Russian gas provided cheap energy. German engineering created precision manufacturing. The combination made Europe's chemical, steel, and automotive industries globally competitive. The system created interdependent industrial clusters that amplified competitive advantages. Automotive suppliers clustered around BMW, Mercedes, and Volkswagen plants. Chemical companies located near petrochemical refineries. Steel mills positioned themselves near coal ports and automotive assembly lines. BASF, the world's largest chemical company, built its entire Ludwigshafen complex around this model. 6 square kilometers of integrated chemical production, consuming as much energy as Denmark. The facility employed 39,000 people and generated $45 billion in annual revenue by converting cheap natural gas into thousands of chemical products. The complex operated like a massive industrial organism. Waste heat from one process powered neighboring facilities. Byproducts from ammonia production became raw materials for plastics manufacturing. Natural gas fed 200 interconnected chemical processes across 300 production plants. The integration achieved 95% energy efficiency through cascaded heat recovery systems. This wasn't just about one company. Europe's industrial ecosystem depended on energy arbitrage. Low input costs created competitive advantage. The system worked because Russian pipeline gas cost 6 per million BTU, while alternatives cost 20s. European governments structured entire economic policies around this advantage. Germany's Energiewende assumed cheap Russian gas would bridge the transition to renewables. France designed nuclear policy expecting gas backup power. Industrial policy across the continent presupposed stable energy inputs at predictable costs. The European industrial system operated on 3 critical assumptions. First, energy supplies would remain stable and affordable. Second, just-in-time supply chains could operate without geopolitical disruption. Third, environmental regulations would phase in gradually without shocking energy costs. These assumptions underpinned trillion-dollar infrastructure investments across the continent. Chemical plants designed for 50-year operating cycles. Steel mills engineered for continuous blast furnace operations. Aluminum smelters requiring uninterrupted power supplies. Energy-intensive industries clustered around major ports and pipeline terminals. Chemical plants, steel mills, aluminum smelters, and glass manufacturers built massive fixed infrastructure, assuming decades of stable operations. These facilities cannot relocate quickly or operate intermittently. A blast furnace costs $2 billion to build and requires constant operation to remain economically viable. Chemical crackers represent $5 billion investments with 20-year payback periods. Aluminum smelting requires such enormous electricity consumption that facilities locate exclusively near cheap power sources. The financial structure amplified this dependency. Companies borrowed against future cash flows, assuming energy costs would remain predictable. Pension obligations, maintenance schedules, and debt service all depended on continuous profitable operations. ThyssenKrupp carried $12 billion in debt secured against steel production assets. BASF borrowed $8 billion against expected chemical plant cash flows. Norsk Hydro leveraged $15 billion against aluminum smelting operations. Banks underwrote these loans, assuming energy costs represented 30% of operating expenses, not 80%. The paradigm shifted permanently in February 2022. European natural gas prices spiked from $30 to $340 per megawatt hour. Even after the initial shock subsided, prices stabilized at 3 times historical levels. The cheap energy era ended overnight. Liquefied natural gas imports couldn't replace pipeline volumes. Terminal capacity limitations created permanent bottlenecks. Alternative suppliers demanded premium pricing. Qatar, Algeria, and Norway extracted maximum economic rent from European desperation. BASF announced its first major production cuts in July 2022. Ammonia plants shut down. Fertilizer production moved to Louisiana. The company began dismantling European operations that had run profitably for 50 years. This wasn't temporary cost-cutting. This was permanent capacity destruction. CEO Martin Brudermüller announced the closure of 60 European facilities. The company relocated its primary ammonia production to the Gulf Coast, where natural gas costs 3 per million BTU compared to Europe's $25. Methanol production shifted to Trinidad. Specialty chemicals moved to Singapore. The numbers revealed the mechanism's irreversibility. BASF's European energy costs increased by $2.2 billion annually. Revenue could not absorb this shock. The only rational response was relocation to regions with affordable energy. Operating margins collapsed from 12% to negative 8% across energy-intensive processes. Variable costs exceeded revenue per unit. Continuing European operations would have generated $200 million monthly losses. The data points accumulated systematically throughout 2023 and 2024. ArcelorMittal idled blast furnaces in Hamburg and Krakow. Norsk Hydro shuttered aluminum smelting in Slovakia. Yara closed fertilizer plants in France and Italy. AkzoNobel relocated paint production to Asia. Covestro moved polyurethane manufacturing to the United States. Evonik shifted specialty chemicals to Singapore. Air Liquide closed hydrogen production facilities across Germany. These weren't isolated decisions. McKinsey documented that 40% of European energy-intensive manufacturing became uncompetitive overnight. Companies faced a binary choice: relocate or liquidate. The consulting firm identified $340 billion in stranded European industrial assets. Production capacity worth decades of investment became economically worthless. Replacement cost exceeded $500 billion, but rebuilding in Europe made no economic sense. The relocation pattern became clear. Chemical production moved to the Gulf states, where natural gas costs 80% less. Steel production shifted to India, where energy costs are 60% lower. Aluminum smelting relocated to Iceland and Canada near renewable energy sources. The geography of global manufacturing rewrote itself according to energy economics. Saudi Arabia gained 25% global market share in petrochemicals. China captured 40% of global steel production. India emerged as the dominant fertilizer producer. European governments offered subsidies, but the mathematics were unforgiving. Germany's temporary energy support programs cost $200 billion, but could only delay the inevitable. Subsidizing uncompetitive energy costs indefinitely was fiscal suicide. France allocated $150 billion to industrial support. The Netherlands spent $80 billion on energy subsidies. These programs represented 15% of annual government budgets. Sustaining such expenditure would have required permanent tax increases or unsustainable debt accumulation. Financial markets recognized the permanence early. European industrial stocks lost 45% of their value, while their overseas competitors gained 30%. Credit rating agencies downgraded European manufacturers while upgrading Asian alternatives. BASF's market capitalization fell from $65 billion to $38 billion. ThyssenKrupp lost 60% of its value. Covestro declined from $18 billion to $7 billion. Hedge funds shorted European industrial debt while going long on Middle Eastern and Asian manufacturers. The beneficiaries emerged quickly. Saudi Aramco expanded petrochemical capacity by 40%. Chinese steel producers gained 15% global market share. American chemical companies captured contracts previously held by European competitors. Reliance Industries in India increased chemical production by 30%. Qatar Petrochemical expanded operations by 50%. These companies inherited not just market share, but technological expertise as European engineers relocated to maintain their careers. European workers face a different reality. European governments confronted impossible choices: maintain environmental policies and accelerate deindustrialization, or abandon climate commitments to preserve industry. Either path carries massive political costs. Green parties demanded continuation of anti-fossil fuel policies. Industrial unions demanded energy cost relief. Regional governments faced collapsing tax bases. National treasuries absorbed massive unemployment costs. The strategic implications compound over time. Europe loses technological leadership in industrial processes. Supply chain expertise migrates to new production centers. The knowledge base that created European manufacturing excellence disperses permanently. Universities lose industry collaboration opportunities. Research and development budgets shift to competitive manufacturing regions. Patent applications declined 25% in European chemical and material sectors. Financial systems absorbed the shock differently. Banks holding industrial loans faced rising default rates. Pension funds invested in European industrial stocks suffered permanent capital destruction. Municipal governments dependent on industrial tax revenue confronted budget crises. Insurance companies covering industrial assets wrote down $180 billion in claims. Credit markets repriced European industrial risk, increasing borrowing costs for surviving manufacturers. Europe's industrial collapse follows a predictable mechanism. Energy costs shocked the system beyond adaptation capacity. Fixed infrastructure became stranded assets. Mobile capital and expertise relocated to competitive regions. The speed surprised observers, but the direction was inevitable once energy arbitrage disappeared. The process appears irreversible because rebuilding industrial infrastructure requires decades and depends on competitive fundamentals that no longer exist. What took 70 years to construct has unwound in 30 months. The question isn't whether European reindustrialization is possible. The question is whether anyone will remember how it worked. Competitive regions. The speed surprised observers, but the direction was inevitable once energy arbitrage disappeared. The process appears irreversible because rebuilding industrial infrastructure requires decades and depends on competitive fundamentals that no longer exist. What took 70 years to construct has unwound in 30 months. The question isn't whether European reindustrialization is possible. The question is whether anyone will remember how it worked.